Diplomatic malpractice in Washington, D.C. Who
Mm.
could have seen that coming, right? When we think about what is supposed to be the cream of the crop, the United States has always, patted itself on the back as being this global leader and setting the stage for how things are supposed to work and leading the NATO alliance, leading the Western world at large, being the leader for the rest of the world, and even those that don't want to come along because, well, we're just that good. Just ask us. We'll tell you. That's kind of how it's gone so far. And look, there's a long track record in our history where we have successfully done a lot of that stuff. Right now, I think if we're being honest, we're running on fumes right now of things that may have been in the past. But the folks that are at the helm right now, especially in our diplomatic corps, are running us into the ground. And we don't need a whole lot of proof, but I'm going to provide it for you anyway today. And there's no better person to help us guide this than somebody who was one of the captains of the ship in the past, and somebody who remains to this day a stalwart of what ought to be American diplomacy. Ambassador Chaz Freeman, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be with you, Danny.
Well, I know that we'll probably have to work hard to keep this less than 6 hours if we're just going to go across the top of the things that are messed up right now. But we'll try to limit it to something a little bit more manageable bites. You and I were exchanging some emails here recently, and you said a few things that just kind of set off even my alarm bells about the development of especially the relationship that how we're managing it between Russia and China and its impact on really global security and on our national interest. And we seem to be helping take that in a direction that I find troublesome. I wonder if you can just kind of, just real quick, even off the top, talk about how things used to be when we're doing it right and what right even looks like in terms of how the U.S. should manage to deal with other great and rising powers, or even a declining power if they're a great power. What should right look like?
Well, I think there's a basic principle of statecraft, which is that you try to divide your adversaries, not to unite them. That is what drove the Nixon trip to Beijing in 1972. He was trying to enlist the Chinese in the containment of the Soviet Union, and he succeeded. Now, there's another principle, however, which is that, and it is especially relevant to nuclear powers, and that is you can't afford to become or to treat another country, another great power, as an implacable enemy, because the dangers of a nuclear exchange under such circumstances are just too great. You could, in fact, end the entire human species, make this planet unlivable. We're violating both principles. We have pushed China and Russia together fundamentally, and you see this in a transformative moment in the most recent visit by Vladimir Putin to Beijing and his meeting with Xi Jinping. Now, this is not an alliance. An alliance is an overall mutual commitment with no conditions to come to mutual aid. This is not what the Chinese-Russian relationship is. It's an entente. An entente is a limited partnership for limited purposes, sometimes for a limited time. But this entente is now very broad and very, very deep, and it is a quasi-alliance. And we've done it. We've done it by our belligerence off the coast of China, and our designation of China as an enemy. And we've done it by our designation of Russia as an enemy and our unfortunately failing activities in Ukraine. So this is not smart. But even worse, with our support, the Ukrainians have now twice attacked elements of the Russian nuclear deterrent. These are the radar stations that provide early warning of a possible attack on Moscow and other places. One of these radar stations was very far, 1,800 kilometers inside Russia, almost on the Kazakhstan border. And now we are essentially, from the Russian point of view, trying to degrade their self-defense capability against a nuclear strike by us. Now, I don't think we intend to make a nuclear strike on Russia, but it would be very imprudent for them to count on
take
us
our
not
word for
doing it. They're not going to take our word for it. So we are in a moment when there must be many people in Moscow now thinking, what do we do? And here there's an example actually from China in the past that is relevant. I had a friend in the Chinese People's Liberation Army who had the temerity to ask, China, has a no first use policy on nuclear weapons. They won't use them against a non-nuclear power, and they won't use them unless they themselves are under nuclear attack. And my friend asked this question. He said, now that the United States has precision-guided munitions, PGMs, and it can attack our nuclear deterrent with conventional warheads, what's the difference between that and a nuclear attack? If the Americans are trying to take out our nuclear deterrent using conventional weapons, is that different from attacking us with a nuclear weapon? And his answer was no. And he was basically called on the carpet, told to shut up by the Chinese leadership because he was calling into question their basic strategic doctrine. Well, we've just done the same thing to the Russians. And,
now not theoretical, but actually.
Not theoretical, it's actual. And this is a very, very dangerous moment in the
Now,
US
on this
Russian
point,
relationship.
I've actually been a little bit surprised, at least publicly. I haven't seen a very muted response from the Russians. Why do you suppose that is?
Because they're figuring out what to do. That's why. I have years ago, a very wise Foreign Service officer, when I became alarmed about a lot of vociferous talk in Sudan about a coup against the then democratic government. He told me, no, you don't worry about it. He said, as long as they're talking vociferously, they're not going to do anything. But you really have to worry when they go silent, because that means something's really about to happen. And
That's not what we need.
so I'm not reassured by the relative silence of the Russians. It is not an indication of a decision one way or another, but they have to make a decision. They can't allow us through our Ukrainian proxies to take apart their nuclear deterrent and the infrastructure that supports it and enables it.
If I'm correct, I believe I saw that there were only actually 10 of these stations surrounding Russia that was providing these, at least primary stations, and two of the 10 have been hit. Whether they've been rendered in op, I don't. It doesn't appear that the damage is that severe, but the fact that they've been hit at all is obviously sends significant alarms into Moscow, into the Kremlin, as it would into the Pentagon and into Washington if the reverse had happened. I wonder if you have any sense at all, whether anything you've heard or just from your knowledge, what do you suppose could be some of the reactions by the Russians here? Because really, let me set the stage. When this war started in February 2022, there was all kinds of concerns about Russian red lines, and it could be crossed by all these different weapon systems and capabilities. And one by one, we put literally all of them. None of them that were on the table then are off the table now, to include the F-16s when that finally makes its show. That's the last one. So many people in Washington, especially, and in the Western world writ large, especially NATO, are like, there really are no red lines. So there literally is nothing that we can't do. What do you say to that?
I think that's crazy. First of all, as we have released various sorts of weapons that we initially refused to release to the Ukrainians, the Russians have retaliated. They're taking out Ukrainian power plants and infrastructure. They would not be doing that if it were not in retaliation for the introduction of weapons that have been fired at their refineries and so forth. So I think this is a mistake. If you try to, even a cornered rat will fight. We're in the process, apparently, of cornering Russia strategically. So I would make one other comment. I'm not an expert on nuclear deterrent systems or the Russian version of those, but I understand that whereas we are able to rely on satellite-based warning systems. The Russian satellite-based system is deficient. It does not provide the kind of time for a Russian decision maker to ponder what is happening and decide whether to counterstrike or not. And they're very dependent on these ground-based radar systems. And we've just taken out 2 of them. So I think from the Russian point of view, this is a tremendous strategic challenge. What they will do, I do not know, but I don't think they can afford to do nothing. And they have been very careful up to this point, really quite restrained in their responses to what they regard as provocations by the United States and NATO. But I don't think we can count on that now. I think we've taken a huge risk. And the fact that it's not even discussed in our media is amazing to me.
Now, let's look at a different angle of that same issue for a second. I'm going to pivot back to China here in a second, because there's been some issues that have popped up here recently. But on that same point there, China seeing that the Russian that this red line was crossed, even if it was an informal red line, that you just nuclear powers just don't take out each other's interceptor or radar missiles that are designed to provide their security and their advanced warning. What does China take away from seeing that the United States is willing to hit Russia's red lines there and poke the bear, so to speak?
Well, I think this will probably redouble apprehensions in China about the possibility of a U.S. attack on China. We've already seen the Chinese plus up their ICBM nuclear force, huge construction going on in the Gobi Desert, with the Pentagon saying that they believe the Chinese will go to about 1,500 warheads aimed at us. In other words, the Chinese are trying to plus up their deterrent to make sure that if there is a war in Taiwan or in the South China Sea, and we enter it, they have the ability to deter us. And up to now, you could say that there's a lot of evidence that from Ukraine, for example, or from Indian Pakistani wars, that nuclear powers can fight conventional wars without escalating to the nuclear level. But that is now, I think, in question. The Chinese have also been very concerned about the $1 trillion U.S. military modernization of our nuclear forces, which apparently includes a lot of emphasis on tactical nuclear weapons. Tactical nuclear weapons, if used, open Pandora's box and lead very rapidly in all of the studies that have been done to a strategic exchange. So I think they're probably looking at this with grave apprehension. And I note that this is occurring at a moment when American diplomatic prestige and influence globally is at an all-time low. That's a result of our handling of the war in Ukraine, which most of the world regards as having been provoked by us. They don't agree with the Russian response, which was an illegal invasion of Ukraine, but they see us as diplomatically having created the situation. And Gaza, where our credibility has been totally shredded. We claim we see genocide in Xinjiang from, putting some people in re-education camps, but we don't see it where women, children, and other people are being shredded by bombs or burned to death. I don't know if you've seen that horrifying
Unfortunately, I have.
The father holding his headless son up in Rafah,
among others.
This any credibility we've had.
And then, Mr. Ambassador, I right before we came on here, I was on News Nation. I'm sorry, a Scripps News hit this morning was asked about they were pointing out that Biden himself keeps setting all these red lines, as he did in Rafah, and what would happen if the Israelis did certain things, and they pointed out to me that then Benjamin Netanyahu has done all of these things, and so they say, is there really a red line? And of course, I mean, what else could I answer except for no? We're just doing whatever we're told. That's an American audience who is very bent not to see things that way. I can only imagine the way it looks to the rest of the world.
Well, there's the other issue here, which is a completely farcical offshore dock that we put in, which was always ridiculous because the problem was the Israelis blocking trucks.
They could have just opened the damn gates any day.
And now this thing, which cost $320 million to put there, has flown apart in heavy seas, and we're getting it repaired in Ashdod in Israel. And in the meantime, nothing is getting through to the starving population in Gaza. So from a point of view of our image internationally, not only do we look like utter hypocrites with totally dishonest double standards, but we also look incompetent. I mean, and not willing to use our power when it is the obvious answer to the horrors that we are all witnessing. We could stop it. We don't.
In a day, literally in a day, not figuratively. Okay, so I want to jump back real quick to the China issue here, because there's some recent events there that just add some fuel to this diplomatic malpractice fire that we're talking about here, which now you see is on multiple continents. So Taiwan just had a presidential election not long ago, and their new president, I may say this wrong, Li Ching-te, is that the right way to pronounce it?
Li Ching-te.
Okay. Has just been inaugurated a few days ago. And China had this big exercise around it, which they called, and they used the term punishment for diplomatic, of some people talking on there. Now, I'm going to ask you a question again in a second, because one of the things you mentioned in the email that spawned this episode today is that you said that he had used what your word coded independence language, which obviously the Chinese felt the same. So I wonder if you can talk to us about that. But before I do that, I want to show you a clip from Sky News who was talking about some of this stuff, and he comes to a disturbing conclusion as well. Watch this.
Also, China's very interested in how Putin's getting on with the invasion of Ukraine, because although the West has been involved to provide ammunition and weapons, it hasn't directly intervened. And all of that will inform Xi Jinping's judgment about whether to go into Taiwan. Now, it wouldn't all go China's way. China's got some difficult economic challenges at the moment. Wars cost a lot of money. And of course, undoubtedly, the West would just stop buying any Chinese exports the moment that something like that happened. But China normally plays the long game. Unfortunately, over time, Taiwan's felt more and more independent. So it feels like time's not on China's side. So China's judgment probably will be the West won't intervene, take about 3 months to take the islands, and they just live with the consequences. And the trouble is with all of this, it just feels it's more likely now when rather than if China decides to take action against Taiwan.
So this particular channel, and this expert here is tended most of the time to be everything's going to be okay. We'll still be able to do okay. For him to say that stood out to me as well. But he used that same term he said it seems like they're getting more independence. You used the word that it seems a coded language for independence. What does that mean?
Well, the new president in Taipei, Lai Ching-te, came to office professing that he would preserve the cautious, moderate pro-independence stance of his predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen, the lady president, who's now stepped down. He deviated from her language. He used language that was correctly, I think, interpreted on the mainland as suggesting that there are two states, that the Chinese Civil War is over, that Taiwan has achieved a completely independent existence, and that it's supported internationally in that role. Well, there are lots of problems with that. First of all, the thing that has kept this civil war from exploding in violence has been a mutual agreement across the Taiwan Strait that there's only one Chinese nation. It may be divided politically for the time being, but there's no equivalence, no separate state in Taiwan, and this is called the One China principle, if you will. And each side has said, well, in the past they've said, well, we're all Chinese. We belong to one Chinese nation, but we have different interpretations of what this means in practice. And that's enough to keep the lid on conflict. He just pulled that lid off in terms of talking about, he said, we're not subordinate to anybody. We're independent, basically. And the response has been, the first time I've ever seen the Chinese openly refer to their activities in the Taiwan Strait and around Taiwan as mock attacks on targets in Taiwan. They just escalated the shows of force that they've been doing. That's what they are. They are shows of force. They're intended to convince Taiwan that if it goes too far, or if it embraces the United States too closely, then they will act militarily. They have the capacity to do that now, unlike in the past. They did not. And they've had 75 years to plan how to take Taiwan. This war has been going on for 75 years, one way or another. And so with all due respect to the commentator on Sky News, who says it will take 3 months to do this, that, and the other, I don't think he knows what he's talking about.
What do you think it would take?
I have no idea, but I'm absolutely sure that the Chinese have planned everything to be sudden and decisive. And when, one of the lessons that they may have taken away from Ukraine is that the incremental Russian approach and the Russian assumption that somehow they would be greeted with flowers and dancing in Kyiv, rather like our imagining that would be the case in Iraq when we went in. That this is nonsense, and that if you're going to act, you have to act boldly and decisively and get it over with. So, as I think I've mentioned to you before, there's a long history here. Taiwan became part of China in the 1680s. After a remnant of or an alleged remnant of the overthrown Ming Dynasty had established itself there, there was a 40-year war. 11 attempts to invade Taiwan. The first 10 failed. About 500,000 men died in those attempts.
Wow.
The 11th succeeded. Now, interestingly, the two places that Chiang Kai-shek, when he retreated to Taiwan, like Zheng Qianggong, his predecessor 3 centuries before, continued to occupy were Quemoy or Jinmen Island, which blockades the port of Xiamen or Amoy, and Mazu, which blockades the port of Fuzhou. And Taiwan occupies both these places. They are part of Fujian province. They're not part of Taiwan. And people who talk about, the Chinese would try to take these from Taiwan don't know what they're talking about. It's very important to the Chinese that Taipei continues to occupy part of the mainland, because that shows this is a civil war.
I see.
And it's among Chinese. And, Taiwan is not independent and can't be. So I think we're seeing a bunch of things come to a head. We talked about the, I think, very great risk that the Russians will react to these attacks on their strategic defenses in some unpredictable way. We've talked about our loss of prestige and influence internationally as a result of the events in the Middle East and our stance on them. And now we have an incipient crisis in the Taiwan Strait. And, we have an election going on here. And the one thing you can say about the probable winner at this point is Donald Trump. And one thing you can say about him is that he's absolutely reliably erratic and unpredictable. And, if you're looking ahead to November of this year and what might happen, the confusion of a transition, and you recall that Trump is bringing in with him a lot of people who are fanatically anti-Chinese, what do you do? There would be a lot of pressure to act.
Well, and that's one other thing I want to get to from something you wrote specifically. But before I get to that next part of your statement that I wanted to ask you about, Here is another complication in how we might react to it. This is Chairman McCall, a U.S. representative, who laid out a very interesting statement about what he may or may not do if something happens in the Taiwan Strait. Check this out.
Speaker McCarthy and yourself have said that multiple times now, that we need to arm Taiwan now before there's any sort of invasion. What about U.S. troops?
I think, then you're talking about an authorized use of military force that would come out of my committee, or a declaration of war, which we haven't utilized since World War II.
Would you support that?
I think if China, Communist China, invades Taiwan, I think that is certainly, if the American people support this, the Congress will follow.
Now, he's not the president.
No, he's just.
I was going to say he's not the president, but it is his committee that something would come out of here. But the question that I have is, it because what you had written is that China had this reaction and this punishment exercise right after the inauguration, but you wrote the full reaction has yet to come. So when they're seeing what happened with the nuclear interceptor radars, and then statements like this, how does all that fold into your concern about that we haven't seen the end of it yet?
Well, I think we need to remind ourselves that we are dealing with a nuclear power. And I think Mr. McCall may have just made his district a target for a Chinese ICBM. Because that statement that, he's ready to declare war on China, basically, is not going to play too well in China. So I go back to the statement I made at the outset that as a principle of statecraft, you do not make implacable enemies of people who can destroy you. That is just stupid. And so what we have, of course, in the United States is a constitutional crisis. We have a president who's out of control. Several presidents, not just this one, but the executive branch has not been checked by either the Congress or the courts for a long time. We have a Congress that is totally partisan and not interested in cooperating at all with the executive. That's what McCall represents. He doesn't want to have the executive manage this. He's talking about declaring war. And we have a Supreme Court that, frankly, has lost most of its legitimacy for reasons of conflict of interest and a high level of politicization.
Right.
A court that doesn't represent majority opinion, but represents years of serious effort by Mitch McConnell and others to pack it with a particular viewpoint. And so our domestic institutions are disorganized and chaotic and at odds with each other, and very hard to manage a foreign policy. One must sympathize with whoever's president. That's his or her job to manage foreign policy. The Congress isn't meant to manage; it's meant to set principles and authorize acts, but it is not meant to develop strategy. And so we have a dysfunctional government. That's not news, I'm sorry to say.
Right. Maybe the degree to which it was might be a little news to some, but I think we always think, well, we'll muddle along here. There's a couple of things that are mitigating against that, especially here. And I think that's why I want to highlight this today to shine a light on some of the concerns that we need to sober up really quickly. I wonder if you can address one thing first, and then I've got a second question that is directly related to however you answer that. Within the Chinese hierarchy, I know you don't have any access into the inner workings there, but you do have lots of history with a lot of the people maybe who have. Especially in the higher ups right now, they have to have a debate between probably a camp that says, let's just continue being patient. Let's wait, whatever. And probably a hothead group, I would guess that most nations seem to have one that says, no, we can't wait. We have to take action now while we get to initiate or whatever. How do you think that kind of conflict within the CCP goes on and related to whether they should ever take action against Taiwan or not?
Well, the Taiwan issue is a domestic political issue for them. And I'm sure that both viewpoints that you mentioned are very much in play. The Chinese leadership is pretty competent. It is experienced. You don't get to the top in China without having climbed all the rungs on the ladder and gained experience. And it is very risk averse. These are not wild men. It's almost impossible to imagine them doing something like the invasion of Iraq that we conducted for, which really was pointless. It was on the basis of fabricated evidence and
Right.
false statements, and didn't have a clear strategy behind it, as we immediately showed when we fired everybody in the Iraqi government and turned the place over to anarchy. Well, you dealt with it on the ground. But I don't see the Chinese acting rashly, but I do see them as determined. And I think we've, the debate in Zhongnanhai, their leadership compound in Beijing, is undoubtedly shifting in favor of the hotheads.
And one of the things you said in there, what if you could explain how this might tail into that, is that you say that under the anti-secession law, they now have every excuse they need to act should they want it. Can you explain what that means?
Well, in 2005, basically, I think copying the Taiwan Relations Act, they passed a law domestically which set out the conditions in which their government would be authorized and, in fact, directed to use force to solve the Taiwan problem, meaning to end the Chinese Civil War through the use of force. And there were a number of conditions in that. And we're meeting all those conditions. There is no credible path to a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan issue anymore. That's the basic factor here that drives this. As long as there is a credible path to a peaceful settlement, the Chinese will pursue that, not the use of force. But if you cut off the possibility, if there's no negotiation, there's no agreement, which is what Mr. Lai basically said in his inaugural address, he's not going to address the question of the relationship with China in negotiations. He's going to stand his ground with American support. If, McCall says, well, he didn't seem to know there are American forces on Taiwan, supposedly just training, but they're a tripwire now, basically. You see all this, and the only thing missing is Taiwan hasn't gone nuclear, because that's another trigger that would invoke the anti-secession law. There's a famous statement by Sun Tzu, the great Chinese strategic thinker, millennia ago, and he says, "Zhi ji zhi bi," to understand yourself, and know your opponent, and you will not fail. And this is just as true between battles as it is during them. It's the basis of diplomacy. It's a pretty good definition of empathy. That is understanding where the other guy's coming from,
Yep.
so that you can help that opponent reach a conclusion that's favorable to your interests,
Right.
rather than whatever it is that he or she started out with. And
And then the other part of that is also true. If you don't know yourself or your enemy, you're screwed. I mean, I'm
I think
paraphrasing.
that's basically correct.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad description of where we are.
That's exactly where
I know there's another point here, and that is, and I seldom agree with anything that Antony Blinken says, but I think he got it right the other day when he lamented the fact that there are, almost no American students now in China. We had 300,000 Chinese students here. That number's gone down. I think the fact that the Chinese have been exposed to us and understand us a lot better than we understand them is a major weakness, and it's going to get worse. And if you have people in the future who are posing as China experts, as they did in the 1950s, who've never been there, don't speak Chinese well, or maybe don't speak it at all, and then they can indulge their wildest fantasies about what China is and isn't, and what it intends and what it does not intend. And this is the sort of stuff that is dominating our media now. Very little of it has any factual basis. It's all conjecture piled on conjecture, and Americans citing other Americans
Yeah.
with supposed insights into the thinking of the Chinese. Well, this is not an effective way to conduct a foreign policy or a business or any other endeavor. And just try conducting your marriage on that basis. See how that goes. Basically, you should. There's a military adage: you should never lose contact with the enemy, because if you do, you'll get surprised. And it's equally true in diplomacy. And you should be talking. And when I say talking, you should be listening more than you talk to someone who can cause trouble for you. And we're not doing that.
Right.
We go there and we lecture them. We say, we want you to do this, this, and this. And they say, well, we have these problems. And we say, well, that's too bad for you. We're not going to do anything about that. And
of course, I'll never forget Blinken's first visit with Chinese after Biden took office.
Oh,
that
boy.
was the very definition of what you just described there.
Yeah.
I want to pivot back over to the joint issue between China and Russia again, because one of the last thing I want to talk about here before we let you go is one of the things that you wrote in here was that we can no longer guarantee that something that happens in one theater won't have ramifications into another, which hasn't been the case up to this point. And here is something that I believe it was John Kirby was talking about. We are at least recognizing there's issues that have to do with the China and Taiwan, China and Russia, but I think we're a little amiss on the application. Watch this. Sorry, I caught Gary a little unawares there.
Gary's
a quick pivot.
Gary's otherwise engaged, I think. But let me comment on the issue. China's been very cautious, and it has not sold any lethal equipment to the Russians during the Ukraine war. Normally, it would have. China's actually now a major producer of advanced weaponry, and the Russians and Chinese have joint research projects, R&D projects for various weapons systems and so forth. But they've been very careful. I don't think we can count on that anymore. No, there are a lot of accusations now that China has been bolstering the Russian economy and providing inputs to military production. I see those as basically an attempt by us to set up a case for, well, we lost the war in Ukraine because of the Chinese. And, now we have to shift to the Chinese enemy after we've screwed up Ukraine and actually devastated Ukraine and left European security architecture in a mess. Now, well, it's all the Chinese fault. So we're going to turn to them. That is a political argument that basically has not much to it, but it's likely to be very credible. And I think what we're looking at now is a situation where if a circumstance is created that requires a war in Taiwan from the Chinese perspective, they can count on a wide range of Russian support. That probably includes not just intel, but armaments production. The Russians have now upped their production incredibly, and they've done a lot of innovation. I think I would imagine that they're sharing the lessons of their drone warfare very closely with the Chinese. And so we're looking at a relationship that was close, but still not a real clinch. And it's moving.
I can only imagine. I mean, I actually can't imagine how this wouldn't have happened or hasn't happened already. In that, one of the biggest weaknesses that we have inflicted upon ourselves with our support of Ukraine so far has been that we've given so much of our weaponry to the Russians to be able to figure out how to defeat. And certainly with electronic warfare, it's in the open source here, they've done a lot of that stuff, to include air-to interceptors. Now, how much you want to guess that technology has gotten into Taiwan or into China? So in the event that they go against our weapons in Taiwan, they already have electronic warfare defeats of it before they've even started.
I think that's a very important point, and I don't doubt for a moment that a good deal of that has happened. Although I do note I've had wonderful statements from our intelligence officers. So, well, we don't know whether they've shared that information or not, but we're sure they have. We don't know, but we're sure. This is not serious. Anyway, the basic point is you don't push your adversaries into an embrace. You try to keep them at arm's length from each other. We've done the opposite, and we're doing more of it. And this business of attacking, there we are, yes, the farewell at Zhongnanhai, an embrace, very un-Chinese, that's a Russian thing. This is Zhongnanhai, the leadership compound in Beijing.
So let me ask you this question, because this is kind of an important one here. In the event that China moves on Taiwan, that let's just say for whatever reason, they calculated that this anti-secession law was met sufficiently and that they felt the time was right based on whatever it is. It doesn't matter what, but they do. What is the chance if we engage? Did you think that Russia and China could actually have an actual military alliance where it could be both of them against us in both places? Or do you think that that's still not possible?
No, I think there's entirely a possibility of a coalition against us, not an alliance, not anything lasting. But I remind you that, we had a coalition with the Soviet Union in World War II against the Nazi Germany and Italy. And, that didn't last.
Right.
It was pretty effective at the time.
Yeah, very much.
We should not assume that people who have a complicated history of antagonism themselves can't come together for the time being to accomplish some common purpose. And at this point, both Russians and Chinese agree that the United States is an international bully that's got to be opposed. And, that we are no longer supportive of the rule of law. We have something we call the rules-based order, which means we make the rules and we decide who gets to have them applied to them and who doesn't, and we exempt ourselves from the rules we apply to everyone else. And this is not acceptable. And unfortunately for us, our behavior has enabled the Chinese and the Russians to get agreement from the vast majority of the world's countries on that American hegemony is not, it should not exist.
Do you see any prospect that we could recognize some of the things you're talking about here and at least see, even if just practically we see, oh crap, this stuff's going a little too far, we better start reining this back in, that we might start changing some of our policies? And if so, what would that look like? What should we start doing right now?
Well, I think you should defer that question to Congressman McCall. We have a large domestic faction that believes that somehow we're omnipotent and we can do whatever we want. You said that earlier with respect to Ukraine. We say we won't do things and then we do them, and the reaction is within bounds, and therefore we conclude that there's no real reason for us to be restrained in our behavior. What could change this? Normally in a democracy, which we claim we still are, this happens in an election. You get somebody who runs for office who says, throw the bastards out and get something new and do something new that works. We have a government which I don't think is delivering the goods to the people, and I don't think is conducting our international affairs effectively. But the two main party candidates seem to be very comfortable with more of the same.
Well, that's where I was going to say that even as you're talking, I'm thinking, wait, what is their positions on Russia, Ukraine, on Israel, Hamas, and on China, Taiwan? And I'm like, wait, are they all the same? Is there any difference?
What about North Korea? That's something nobody ever talks about. Maximum pressure on North Korea has created an nuclear ICBM force that can hit our country. That threat wasn't there before. Donald Trump, to his credit, was willing to talk to Kim Jong-un. Unfortunately, he bungled those talks. and nothing came of them. And in fact, North Korea is now not only completely intransigent and vociferously anti-American, but it now has renewed relationships with Russia and China that it didn't have. Now, we have put together a group which includes Iran, China, Russia,
Right.
and North Korea.
Unbelievable.
And this is a group which exercises in many ways more influence internationally in terms of global positions on issues of concern to us than we do. Now, you want proof of incompetence? That's it, man. This is just not a viable situation.
Well, it's not, but we just have to keep hoping that by at least shining a light on the truth so that people can see, and just, if nothing else, have a stark representation of where we are and headed and where we need to go and we need to change. Potentially the people can help fund or force a change. But man, right now, if we just leave it up to the political system here, not a lot of optimism.
Unfortunately, no. Our system is venal and corrupt, unimaginative and incompetent at the moment. That is not the republic I grew up in, or you did, or you
Not the one I
served.
fought for, yeah.
And but here we are.
But here we are. We're going to have to do the best that we can with what we have to work with, and we are very grateful for you, at the very least, for calling out what things are and illuminating where the issues are that need to be addressed. And so we're grateful for that. And thank you for coming back on today, Mr. Ambassador.
A pleasure.
And we thank you guys for coming on as well. We also just want to let you know, if you haven't already seen it, I know some of you has, because I've seen some of you in the comments here on the right here. We have a new feature here to where you can engage with us, and you can come on and you can become a member. Look for that member button. It should be up there now. It wasn't there before. To where you can be a part. You can have exclusive content, things that nobody else is going to get. You can engage directly with me and with Gary sometimes as we talk to people and actually go back and forth, stuff that we can't always do on these comment lines here. But we look forward to doing that, and you get some behind the scenes stuff, just stuff you're not going to get anywhere else. If you want to be a member and engage a little bit more directly, we welcome you to do that, because we love to engage with you folks, because we are, after all in this together, and we remain unintimidated and uncompromised for you, even when some of the news is not as good as what you'd like. And by the way, don't forget, we have John Mearsheimer on at 2 p.m. today. Definitely don't want to miss that. He's one of the stars we have on here, along with Ambassador Freeman. And tune back in at 2 p.m. today for John Mearsheimer. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.